Welcome everyone. Today we are going to travel far back in time to learn the fascinating story of Islam from the very beginning. This beautiful story did not just appear suddenly out of nowhere. It began more than 1400 years ago in a specific, difficult land filled with ancient tribes, rich traditions, and many different, complex beliefs. To truly understand this religion, which is followed by more than 1 billion people today, we must first look carefully at what the world looked like before the message of Islam arrived. Our long journey starts in the Arabian Peninsula. This was a massive sweeping desert region positioned perfectly between the great continents of Asia, Africa, and Europe. Today, this large area is home to modern countries like Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, and Yemen. But over a millennium ago, the landscape was incredibly harsh and unforgiving. There were very few rivers to provide water, and the dry climate made farming almost impossible. Because survival was so difficult, many people lived a tough, nomadic life. They constantly moved across the hot sand from place to place with their large herds of camels, always desperately searching for food and water. In this harsh desert, people survived by organizing themselves into tribes. A tribe was essentially a massive, extended family group. In this ancient society, absolute loyalty to your tribe was the most important rule of life. People bravely protected their tribal members and supported each other against the dangerous desert. However, this intense loyalty also created deep divisions, and tribes often fought terrible, bloody wars against each other for many years, sometimes over very small, foolish reasons. Right in the middle of this vast, dry region was a highly important and bustling city called Mecca. Mecca was not a powerful city because of rich farming or massive armies. Instead, it drew its great power from two things: lucrative trade and ancient religion. Merchants who traveled long distances between Africa, Asia, and the Mediterranean Sea often stopped in Mecca to rest. This made the city a very busy, vibrant place where expensive goods, new ideas, and different cultures constantly mixed together. But Mecca held an even deeper secret. In the very center of the busy city stood a highly sacred, ancient, cube-shaped building known as the Kaaba. According to deep historical tradition, people believed this structure was built long ago by the prophet Abraham, known as Ibrahim, and his son Ishmael, known as Ismail. Originally, the beautiful Kaaba was meant to be a pure place to worship only one God. However, as centuries passed, the beliefs of the people in Arabia slowly changed. Instead of worshiping one single creator, the tribes began practicing polytheism, meaning they believed in many different gods. Over time, more than 300 different idols and statues were placed inside and all around the sacred Kaaba. People believed these stone and wooden idols represented powerful gods of nature and supernatural spirits. The powerful Quraysh tribe controlled this religious center, making Mecca extremely wealthy as tribes from all over Arabia traveled there for religious pilgrimages. While the Arabian people beautifully valued bravery, poetry, and warm hospitality toward strangers, their society also suffered from serious moral problems. There was terrible injustice. The rich often treated the poor unfairly, and slavery was widespread. Women had very limited rights, and tragically, some families even buried their newborn daughters alive because they deeply feared poverty and social shame. Arabia was a land desperately searching for guidance. The world was changing, and right in the middle of this busy, divided desert city, a child was about to be born who would change the entire course of human history. Around the year 570 CE, in the very city of Mecca, a deeply important event happened. A child was born who would later become one of the most influential figures in all of human history. His name was Muhammad. According to deep historical tradition, the year Muhammad was born was widely remembered by the local people as the Year of the Elephant. Why was it called this? In that specific year, a powerful and ambitious ruler from Yemen named Abraha marched toward the city of Mecca with a massive, frightening army. His main goal was to completely destroy the sacred Kaaba. He wanted the desert tribes to stop visiting Mecca and instead travel to his own newly built religious center in Yemen. To make sure he won this battle, Abraha's army brought enormous elephants with them, which was something incredibly unusual and terrifying for the people of Arabia to see. But before this great army could reach the Kaaba, something entirely unexpected happened. Historical accounts and ancient traditions say that large dark groups of birds suddenly appeared high in the sky. These birds dropped stones onto the invading army, forcing the frightened soldiers to retreat. The massive army was completely defeated before it could ever touch or destroy the Kaaba. Because of this incredibly dramatic and memorable event, that time became forever known among the tribes as the Year of the Elephant. It was during this very same remarkable year that Muhammad was born. He was born into the powerful Quraysh tribe, the same respected tribe that controlled the city of Mecca and the Kaaba. His family specifically belonged to a very honorable and respected clan within that tribe, known as Banu Hashim. Although his family possessed an honorable reputation, they were actually not very wealthy. Muhammad's father was a man named Abdullah, and his mother was named Amina. But something very sad and difficult happened even before this special child was born into the world. His father, Abdullah, died while Amina was still pregnant. This tragic event meant that Muhammad entered the harsh desert world already an orphan from his father's side. This early hardship and deep loss would profoundly shape his character and his life in many different ways. In those ancient days, it was a common tradition for babies born in the busy city of Mecca to spend their early years living with Bedouin families far out in the open desert. The clean, quiet desert environment was believed to be much healthier for growing children. It also helped the young children learn strong, pure language and vital survival skills. So, when Muhammad was still just a tiny baby, he was taken to live with a kind Bedouin woman named Halima. Halima and her family cared for the young boy deeply in the quiet desert for several years. According to beautiful traditional stories, Halima later said that almost immediately after Muhammad came into her humble home, her family began experiencing unexpected and wonderful blessings. Their animals suddenly became healthier, and their difficult lives significantly improved. Whether people today see these beautiful stories as divine miracles or simply rich tradition, they became a very important part of the early narrative of Muhammad's remarkable life. After spending several peaceful years with Halima in the vast, open desert, the young Muhammad eventually returned to the busy city of Mecca to live with his mother Amina. However, Muhammad's precious time with his mother did not last very long at all. When he was only about 6 years old, a terrible tragedy occurred. His mother Amina passed away while they were traveling together on a journey. This heartbreaking loss meant that the young boy had now lost both of his parents at a very young age. He was truly and completely an orphan in a harsh world. After his mother's sudden death, Muhammad was taken in by his loving grandfather Abdul Muttalib. His grandfather was a highly respected leader in Mecca and cared deeply for his young grandson. But sadly, this warm comfort also did not last long. Only about 2 years later, his grandfather also passed away. Now, Muhammad was only 8 years old, and he had already experienced the painful loss of his father, his mother, and his grandfather. After this, he was placed under the careful protection of his uncle, Abu Talib. Abu Talib was a very kind and highly respected man in the community, but he was not a wealthy leader. He had to work incredibly hard every day just to support his family. Muhammad grew up in this humble household where he quickly learned the true value of hard work, deep patience, and quiet responsibility. As a young boy, he actively helped his uncle by taking care of sheep and other animals in the dry hills. This may sound like a very simple, ordinary job, but in those ancient days, it taught a person incredibly important life skills. A good shepherd needed immense patience, careful observation, and calm thinking to protect the flock. As Muhammad grew older and became a young man, the people living in Mecca began to notice something truly special about his character. He became widely known throughout the city for being strictly honest, highly trustworthy, and deeply respectful to everyone he met. In a society where business and trade were extremely important, having someone you could trust meant absolutely everything. Merchants desperately needed someone reliable to safely carry their expensive goods and manage complex trade deals. Because of his incredibly strong and pure character, the people of Mecca started calling Muhammad Al-Amin, This beautiful Arabic name translates to the trustworthy or the honest one. Even people who later disagreed with his message still deeply respected his honesty. When Muhammad was still a young man, he sometimes traveled long distances with massive trade caravans. These long journeys took him far away to places like Syria and other distant trading cities. During these travels, he saw many different cultures, religions, and ways of life, meeting people who followed Christianity and Judaism. These experiences helped him understand the wider world beyond Mecca and shaped his thinking about society, justice, and faith. When Muhammad was about 25 years old, an important event happened that would change his life. A respected and wealthy businesswoman in Mecca named Khadijah was looking for someone completely trustworthy to manage her growing trading business. Because of his perfect reputation, many people recommended him, and Muhammad began working for Khadijah, managing her important trade caravans with great integrity and success. Khadijah was so deeply impressed by his character that she eventually proposed marriage to him. Their marriage became one of the most respected and loving partnerships in all of Mecca, built strongly on trust, respect, and loyalty. Even though Muhammad lived a relatively normal and peaceful life as a devoted husband, a caring father, and a successful merchant, he often spent a great deal of his time thinking deeply about the vast world around him. He was a man of deep thought, and as he walked through the busy markets of Mecca, he saw many serious social problems that troubled his heart. He vividly saw the endless tribal conflicts that divided families, the terrible injustice shown toward the poor, the deep social inequality, and the profound confusion of people worshipping hundreds of silent idols around the sacred Kaaba. These heavy observations deeply troubled him, making him realize that society was searching for guidance. Muhammad was not a man searching for worldly fame, political power, or tribal leadership. He was simply a quiet man searching for true understanding and spiritual peace. To find this peace, he would often leave the crowded, noisy, and busy streets of Mecca to seek out a quiet, isolated place far outside the city. High above the desert sands, there was a quiet, rocky mountain near Mecca known as Jabal al-Nur, which translates beautifully to the Mountain of Light. Nestled securely inside this steep and rocky mountain was a very small, dark, and quiet cave called Hira. Muhammad would climb the steep, dusty paths to this high cave simply to reflect, to pray, and to think deeply about life, society, and the ultimate truth. He would spend long, peaceful hours there in absolute silence, completely away from the chaos of the city below. He did this many times over the course of several years, finding immense comfort in the quiet isolation. But one specific night, when Muhammad was around 40 years old, an event happened inside that small cave that would change not only his own life, but the history of the entire world. One night, while he was completely alone in the absolute quiet of the cave of Hira, an unexpected, overwhelming, and deeply powerful experience suddenly took place. According to deep Islamic tradition, an angel suddenly appeared before him. This heavenly being was the angel Gabriel, known in Arabic as Jibril. This was absolutely not something Muhammad had ever expected to happen, and, at first, he did not fully understand what was taking place. The powerful angel looked at him and commanded him with a single, heavy instruction to read or to recite. Trembling in the small enclosed space, Muhammad honestly replied that he did not know how to read. But the angel's powerful command came again, and once more Muhammad answered that he could not read. Finally, the angel delivered the very first profound words of what would much later become part of the Holy Quran. These magnificent first words spoke deeply about human creation and divine knowledge, specifically commanding people to read in the name of the one who created all human beings. This singular historic moment is widely known today as the first revelation, and it marks the true spiritual beginning of the message that would later be called Islam. The experience was so overwhelmingly powerful that after the angel departed, Muhammad felt deeply frightened and completely confused. His heart was racing wildly in his chest, and he was completely unsure of what had just happened to him in the dark silence of the mountain. Seeking safety and familiar comfort, he quickly left the small cave, hurried down the steep mountain path, and rushed back to his home in the city of Mecca. When Muhammad finally reached the safety of his home in Mecca, he was still trembling from the overwhelming encounter in the mountain cave. His heart was racing wildly in his chest, and his tired mind was struggling to understand exactly what had just happened to him. He immediately turned to his loving wife Khadija and urgently asked her to cover him with a heavy blanket because he was shaking so violently from the experience. Sitting closely together in the quiet safety of their home, he carefully told her everything he had just witnessed in the dark silence of Mount Hira. In that terrifying and uncertain moment, Khadija did something incredibly beautiful. Instead of doubting his strange story or thinking he was losing his mind, she gently and warmly comforted him. She reminded her husband of the pure, noble kind of person he had always been. She looked into his eyes and told him that he was deeply honest, remarkably generous, and a man who always went out of his way to help the poor and those in desperate need. Because of his consistently good and righteous character, she firmly believed that something profoundly meaningful and divine had just happened to him. In that quiet room, Khadija became the very first person in the world to believe in Muhammad and fully support his extraordinary mission. Her unwavering emotional support would become extremely important in the difficult early days of Islam. Seeking more understanding, Khadija later took Muhammad to meet her older relative, a wise man named Waraka. Waraka was widely known throughout the city as a highly learned man who was very familiar with earlier religious scriptures and ancient traditions. After listening carefully to Muhammad describe the powerful experience with the angel in the cave, the old man shared a heavy truth. Waraka said that the heavenly being who had appeared to him was the exact same angel who had historically appeared to earlier prophets. He looked directly at Muhammad and told him that he had been specially chosen to deliver a monumental message to humanity. However, the wise man also offered a very serious warning. He warned the new prophet that the difficult path ahead of him would absolutely not be easy. He explained that almost all of the great prophets before him had faced terrible opposition, deep hatred, and painful rejection from their own people. Hearing these heavy words, Muhammad now began to fully understand that his quiet, peaceful life was about to change forever. The divine message that Muhammad began to quietly share with the world was surprisingly simple, but it was deeply powerful. At its very center was one uncompromising revolutionary idea. There is only one God. In the beautiful Arabic language, the specific word for the one God is Allah. The message strictly taught that the people of Arabia should immediately stop worshiping the hundreds of silent carved idols and instead dedicate their lives to worshiping the one true creator of the entire universe. But the message was not only about prayer. It also taught many beautiful and necessary moral values that society desperately needed. It boldly commanded the people to actively help the poor, to be completely honest in all their business dealings, to treat every single person fairly, and to tenderly care for helpless orphans. It ordered them to completely avoid injustice and all forms of cruelty. These revolutionary ideas were incredibly powerful precisely because they directly challenged many of the unjust existing traditions and practices in the wealthy city of Mecca. At the very beginning of this monumental journey, Muhammad did not publicly announce this new message to everyone in the busy city streets. Instead, he shared it very quietly and privately only with the people he deeply trusted. The very first people to accept the message were those who were very close to him. The earliest believers included Khadija, his devoted wife, Ali, his young and intelligent cousin who lived in his household, Abu Bakr, a highly respected merchant and his closest friend, and Zayd, a young man who was an important part of his household. Together, these early believers formed the very first, incredibly small group of Muslims. The beautiful Arabic word Islam simply means a deep, peaceful submission to the will of God, and a person who consciously follows the path of Islam is called a Muslim. At first, this brave group was very small, gathering in secret to pray together and slowly learn the beautiful new message. After some time had passed, Muhammad was instructed to begin sharing the divine message much more openly with the world. Stepping out of the quiet shadows, he began speaking directly to the people in the busy streets of Mecca about the profound idea of one God and the importance of living a moral and just life. The reactions of the people were deeply divided. Some individuals stopped in the dusty streets and listened with genuine curiosity, and some fully accepted the beautiful message. But many others reacted with intense anger and terrible fear. This intense fear existed because the new message directly challenged the ancient, deeply rooted traditions that had existed in Mecca for many generations. The wealthy and powerful leaders of the Quraysh tribe were especially concerned by this sudden shift in the city. Their immense political power, social influence, and booming economy were all directly connected to the profitable idol worship taking place around the sacred Kaaba. If the desert tribes suddenly stopped worshipping these hundreds of idols, the leaders deeply feared that their absolute authority and lucrative business would severely weaken and collapse. Because of this immense fear of losing their status, the wealthy leaders felt that Muhammad's message directly threatened their traditions and their economy, causing the opposition to Islam to become much stronger. At the very beginning, the opposition they faced was mostly verbal mockery and sharp criticism. The leaders tried to stop Muhammad by loudly arguing with him and publicly insulting him in the streets. Some people laughed cruelly at the very idea of abandoning their traditional, ancient idols. They called him terrible names and falsely accused Muhammad of simply inventing wild stories or desperately trying to gain political power for himself. However, despite these insults, the profound ideas of one God, true justice, and human equality continued to deeply attract people from many different backgrounds, including merchants, young people, and the desperately poor. Many enslaved individuals felt a beautiful, glowing hope in the revolutionary message that all humans were perfectly equal before God. But as more people began accepting the message, the opposition slowly changed from simple insults and became much stronger and significantly more serious. The leaders of Mecca began using brutal physical pressure and terrible punishment to stop the movement. The early Muslims were still a very small and incredibly vulnerable group. They had no organized army, absolutely no political power, and very little physical protection in this harsh society. While those early Muslims who had strong tribal families to protect them were somewhat safer, those who were poor, enslaved, or without powerful families faced much harsher and more brutal treatment. Because they lacked social power, they were often the very first to face terrible mistreatment and dark pressure from the angry leaders. One of the most well-known and heartbreaking examples of this cruelty is the story of Bilal, who was an enslaved man living in Mecca. When his cruel master discovered that Bilal had bravely accepted the message of Islam, he punished him severely. Bilal was violently dragged out into the hot, unforgiving desert and forced to lie down on the burning sand. Heavy, crushing stones were placed directly on his chest to force him to reject his faith. Despite experiencing this agonizing, suffocating pain, Bilal refused to surrender. He continued repeating the simple, powerful words, "One God, one God." Eventually, Muhammad's close companion, Abu Bakr, mercifully bought Bilal's freedom and completely rescued him from the horrors of slavery. Stories exactly like this one beautifully showed the unbreakable strength of belief among the early Muslims. Seeing that torturing the weak did not stop the faith from growing, the leaders of Mecca also tried to pressure Muhammad directly. They approached him with massive worldly temptations, offering him vast wealth, absolute leadership, and great power if he would simply stop preaching his message. But Muhammad firmly refused their offers. He calmly explained that his divine mission was absolutely not about acquiring money or achieving high social status. His only mission was to faithfully deliver the message he had received. Because he bravely refused to compromise his beliefs, the dark opposition against him only continued to grow. As the persecution in Mecca became increasingly severe and dangerous, Muhammad felt a deep responsibility to protect his vulnerable followers. As the persecution became more serious, Muhammad advised some of his followers to leave Mecca temporarily to find safety. Seeking a peaceful refuge away from the cruelty of the Quraysh, a brave group of early Muslims traveled across the sea to the distant land of Abyssinia, which is part of modern-day Ethiopia. The ruler of this foreign land, known respectfully as the Negus, was widely known for being a remarkably fair and just leader. When the exhausted Muslims arrived and carefully explained their difficult situation and their peaceful beliefs, the Negus mercifully allowed them to stay and live peacefully within his borders. This remarkable journey was the first migration of Muslims in history, providing a brief moment of hope in a dark time. Back in Mecca, however, the powerful leaders of the Quraysh were furious. They decided on a harsh new strategy to completely crush the growing movement. They organized a severe social and economic boycott against Muhammad's entire clan, the Banu Hashim, who were bravely protecting him. The strict, unforgiving rules of this cruel boycott meant that people in the city were completely forbidden from trading with them, marrying into their families, or even socializing with them. Forced into a dry, isolated valley outside the main city, for nearly 3 agonizing years, Muhammad and his dedicated supporters lived in very difficult conditions. During this dark time, basic food became incredibly scarce, and entire families struggled daily just to survive. The harsh desert elements. Despite the near starvation and intense isolation, they remained incredibly patient and absolutely did not give up their deeply held beliefs. Eventually, some compassionate people in Mecca began to feel that the extreme boycott was simply too unfair. The cruel agreement was finally broken, and the boycott ended. However, the end of the boycott did not bring lasting relief. Soon after the boycott ended, 2 deeply painful and heartbreaking events happened in Muhammad's life. First, his beloved and fiercely loyal wife Khadija passed away. She was his greatest source of earthly comfort. She had always supported him, comforted him, and firmly believed in his message from the very beginning. Shortly after her devastating death, another massive loss occurred when his beloved uncle, Abu Talib, also passed away. Even though his uncle Abu Talib did not ever formally accept Islam, he had always courageously protected Muhammad from the dangerous enemies in Mecca. Suddenly, without Khadija's vital emotional support and Abu Talib's powerful physical protection, Muhammad felt a profound and heavy, deep sense of loss. Because of this overwhelming grief, this incredibly difficult period became widely known as the Year of Sadness. Feeling entirely isolated in his hometown and hoping to find new supporters for his divine message, Muhammad bravely traveled to a nearby mountainous city called Taif. He approached the powerful leaders there, spoke to them earnestly about Islam, and warmly invited them to listen to the message of one God. But instead of showing Arab hospitality or accepting his peaceful message, many people in Taif rejected him incredibly harshly. The rejection quickly turned violent. Some people openly mocked him, and others even threw sharp stones at him as he desperately tried to leave the hostile city. Bleeding and exhausted, it was undoubtedly one of the most painful and humiliating moments of his entire life. Yet, despite the cruel rejection and his severe physical injuries, Muhammad remained remarkably patient and steadfastly continued his divine mission without surrendering to despair. Around this time of intense difficulty and deep sadness, something incredibly important began to happen that would change the entire future of the movement. Some curious visitors from a distant city called Yathrib met Muhammad during their seasonal travels to the busy markets of Mecca. Yathrib was located far to the north of Mecca and was a city with several different tribes that often had bitter, violent conflicts with each other. These tribal wars had exhausted the people, leaving them desperate for a solution to their endless fighting. When these weary visitors heard Muhammad's powerful and inspiring message about establishing peace, true justice, and human unity, they were deeply interested. They quickly recognized that his unique wisdom and fair character could heal their broken, divided society. Therefore, they warmly invited him to come to their city and help bring lasting peace among their warring tribes. Over time, as his teachings spread through the northern city, more people from Yathrib accepted Islam and promised to protect and support Muhammad if he chose to live among them. Seeing a true opportunity for safety, religious freedom, and a fresh start, eventually, Muhammad instructed his vulnerable followers in Mecca to quietly move to Yathrib. It was a massive, heartbreaking sacrifice for these early believers to leave their ancestral homes, their businesses, and their properties behind. Yet one by one, small groups of devoted Muslims secretly left their homes under the cover of darkness and bravely traveled north. Finally, when most of his followers were safe, Muhammad himself prepared to leave his beloved hometown. But the furious leaders of Mecca had discovered the secret plan. They were absolutely terrified of him escaping and establishing a new, strong base of power in a rival city. Because of this fear, they decided to stop him permanently by surrounding his house at night. Despite the intense, life-threatening danger lurking just outside his door, however, Muhammad and his close, trusted companion Abu Bakr managed to leave the house safely without being captured. Knowing that angry armed search parties would immediately begin tracking them across the open sands, they carefully hid for several days in a dark cave outside the city before continuing their long journey. They waited patiently in the absolute silence of the rocky mountain, trusting entirely in their faith while the danger passed. After traveling exhaustingly across the harsh, unforgiving desert, completely exposed to the elements, they finally arrived safely in Yathrib. The people of the city rejoiced and welcomed them warmly, filling the dusty streets with songs of celebration and offering them the safety they had been brutally denied in Mecca. Soon after this joyous and historic arrival, the city was transformed and became known as Medina, which beautifully means the city of the Prophet. This monumental migration, known historically as the Hijra, was one of the most absolutely important events in all of Islamic history. It was a profound turning point because it marked the exact moment when the Muslim community moved from being a small, deeply persecuted group to confidently forming an entirely new, independent society. Because of its massive historical importance and the glorious fresh start it provided for the believers, the Hijra later became the official starting point of the Islamic calendar. Finally safe within the welcoming walls of Medina, Muhammad would begin the great historic work of building a thriving community based strictly on faith, mutual cooperation, and perfect justice. When the exhausted travelers finally arrived in the safe and welcoming oasis of Medina, they experienced a completely different and beautiful atmosphere. The generous and kind-hearted people of Medina, who warmly welcomed them into their homes, were affectionately called the Ansar, a beautiful Arabic word meaning the helpers. The migrants from Mecca had left absolutely all their wealth, properties, and businesses behind, arriving with almost nothing. Recognizing this desperate situation, one of the very first and most important steps Muhammad took was to create incredibly strong, unbreakable bonds between these two distinct groups of people. He formally and carefully paired many of the struggling migrants with the local helpers so they could financially and emotionally support each other exactly like blood family. This profound act of brotherhood erased old tribal loyalties and successfully created deep unity and unprecedented cooperation in the newly formed society. For the very first time since the revelations began, the Muslim community was finally living together in a secure, structured place where they could practice their faith freely without the terrifying shadow of persecution. Now that they had a safe place to live, the growing community desperately needed a central gathering place. Soon after arriving in Medina, one of the absolute first physical things Muhammad did was build a community mosque. In the Islamic faith, a mosque is not merely a quiet, empty building used only for silent worship. It is a dynamic living place where Muslims gather to pray together, continuously learn, and intimately meet as a united community. The very first mosque constructed in Medina was incredibly simple and deeply humble in its physical architecture. It was built entirely by hand, utilizing rough palm tree trunks for supporting pillars, thick mud walls to keep out the intense desert heat, and a simple shaded roof made of woven palm branches. But even though it was physically simple and lacked any expensive decorations or grand designs, it instantly became the vibrant, beating heart of the community. People eagerly gathered there daily, not only to pray side by side but also to openly discuss their social problems, make democratic community decisions, and carefully learn about the profound depths of their faith. Because of its multi-purpose role in daily life, this humble, mud brick mosque became one of the absolute most important places in all of early Islamic history. However, the bustling city of Medina was not exclusively inhabited by Muslims. It was a complex, diverse oasis that was home to several different groups of people. There were the newly arrived Muslims, but there were also ancient Jewish tribes and other distinct communities comfortably living there. Rather than forcing his beliefs on others or creating a painfully divided city, Muhammad brilliantly worked to create a fair, legal system where all these diverse groups could live together safely and peacefully. To achieve this remarkable harmony, a groundbreaking historical document known as the Constitution of Medina was carefully created and agreed upon by the city's inhabitants. This remarkable and forward-thinking agreement firmly established clear rules for mutual cooperation and guaranteed protection among the many different tribes and religious communities sharing the city. It clearly explained that absolutely everyone living in Medina, regardless of their specific faith or tribal background, must work together equally to maintain peace, ensure true justice, and provide security against outside enemies. In a harsh desert world previously ruled only by chaotic tribal violence, this visionary document was truly ahead of its time. It stands today as one of the very earliest historical examples of a formal, written agreement successfully creating a cohesive, multi-community society. Even though the Muslims had finally found a place of safety and peace within the welcoming walls of Medina, the powerful leaders back in Mecca were still incredibly angry and deeply resentful. They looked across the desert and saw the rapidly growing united Muslim community as a massive, existential threat to their traditional way of life. Adding to this bitter anger was the fact that many Muslims had been forced to leave their ancestral homes, their businesses, and all their valuable property behind in Mecca when they fled, and the unresolved tensions between the two opposing sides only continued to grow stronger day by day. Eventually, this heavy, unbearable tension erupted and led to several severe physical conflicts and historical battles. These painful events were incredibly difficult, but they deeply shaped the character and the early history of the growing Muslim community. One of the very first and most major conflicts to occur was known as the Battle of Badr. In this terrifying confrontation, the Muslim group was much smaller and poorly equipped compared to the massive, heavily armed forces from Mecca. But despite being vastly outnumbered in the harsh desert environment, the Muslims miraculously managed to win the desperate battle. For the early Muslim community, this unexpected and profound victory became a monumental moment of glowing hope and newfound confidence. It deeply strengthened their core belief that true patience and unwavering determination could absolutely help them overcome the greatest of life's challenges. However, life is filled with trials, and not every single event ended in a glorious victory. There were other fierce battles and incredibly difficult moments that severely tested the physical and spiritual strength of the young community. One such devastating event was the Battle of Uhud, where the Muslims faced incredibly serious challenges and heartbreaking, painful losses on the battlefield. Yet even in defeat, these heavy moments taught the resilient community vital, lasting lessons about the absolute importance of strict discipline, inner unity, and quiet perseverance. Despite these immense, painful difficulties, the Muslim community remarkably continued to grow as more and more people across the vast lands of Arabia were becoming deeply curious about the beautiful message of Islam. Years later, longing to see their sacred homeland, Muhammad and a large group of devoted Muslims decided to travel peacefully toward Mecca simply to perform a religious pilgrimage. However, the suspicious leaders of Mecca quickly stopped them in the desert before they could even enter the holy city. After long, tense negotiations under the hot sun, both sides finally agreed to a historic peace agreement called the Treaty of Hudaybiyah. At first, some of the Muslims felt frustrated, believing the treaty seemed incredibly unfair to them. But over time, it proved to be a very important and brilliant decision, because there was finally a guaranteed peace between the two warring sides. Because of this treaty, people could travel safely and communicate much more freely across the desert sands. As a direct result of this open communication, many more people finally had the chance to truly learn about Islam and accepted it into their hearts. It powerfully proved that sometimes quiet peace can achieve far more than violent conflict. A few years later, however, this crucial peace agreement was unfortunately broken by one of the allied tribes connected to Mecca. Because the treaty was violated, Muhammad and a massive unified group of his followers marched purposefully toward Mecca. But instead of seeking bloody, terrible revenge for all the years of torture and exile, their approach was remarkably calm, highly disciplined, and completely controlled. When the large Muslim army finally entered the streets of Mecca, many terrified people inside the city expected a brutal punishment or a devastating, violent conflict. Instead, displaying unimaginable mercy, Muhammad declared a general, sweeping forgiveness for almost all the people who had previously hurt them. He peacefully went to the sacred Kaaba, completely removed the hundreds of silent idols from around it, and beautifully restored it as a pure place dedicated solely to the worship of one God. This monumental, bloodless moment was widely known as the peaceful conquest of Mecca. It became one of the absolute most important and profound turning points in the entire history of Islam. After witnessing this incredible display of mercy and power in Mecca, many different tribes across the vast expanse of Arabia began enthusiastically accepting Islam. Some individuals were deeply inspired by the pure message of absolute unity and perfect justice. Others simply respected the rapidly growing strength, the undeniable stability, and the moral character of the Muslim community. Slowly, the powerful message that had started with a very small, frightened group of believers was now confidently spreading across the entire Arabian Peninsula. The fragmented society that had once been violently divided by endless tribal conflicts was now finally beginning to move toward a beautiful shared faith and lasting cooperation. The small group that once struggled quietly and fearfully in the shadows of Mecca had now miraculously become a massive, strong, and beautifully organized community. But the complete story of Islam was absolutely not only about this rapid growth and widespread geographical expansion. It was also deeply about the final, emotional years of the dedicated prophet who had bravely carried this heavy message through long years of intense difficulty, endless patience, and unbreakable determination. About 10 years after the historic and difficult migration to Medina, Prophet Muhammad performed what would eventually become widely known throughout history as his final pilgrimage back to the holy city of Mecca. During this profound religious journey, thousands upon thousands of devoted Muslims from many different distant parts of Arabia eagerly traveled across the harsh desert to Mecca just to join him. For many of these people, this was the very first time they ever saw such a massive, peaceful gathering of believers who were completely united by one single faith rather than divided by old tribal hatred. During this beautiful and emotional pilgrimage, Muhammad stood before the massive crowd and gave an incredibly important, moving speech that later became universally known as the farewell sermon. This powerful historic speech perfectly summarized many of the core foundational principles that the religion of Islam taught to humanity. In this final message, he passionately reminded the listening people about the absolute importance of treating all others with perfect justice, deeply respecting the rights of women, fiercely protecting the weak and the poor, and strictly avoiding all forms of economic exploitation and unfair treatment. He made sure they clearly understood that all humans are entirely equal regardless of their specific tribe or ethnic background. He powerfully reminded the people that no single race or tribe is ever superior to another, and that what truly matters in the eyes of God is simply good character and quiet righteousness. For many modern historians and religious scholars, this profound message of universal equality became one of the absolute most important teachings in all of Islamic history. After successfully completing the sacred pilgrimage, Muhammad returned peacefully to the city of Medina, the very place where he had carefully built and nurtured the Muslim community over many difficult years. By this specific time in history, the profound message of Islam had successfully spread across much of the vast Arabian Peninsula. Ancient, warring tribes that had once violently fought each other for many generations were now miraculously beginning to live together in peace under a beautiful, shared set of moral principles. But soon after returning to the quiet safety of Medina, Muhammad began to feel seriously ill. At first, the sudden illness simply seemed like a common passing fever. But over a short period of time, it became painfully clear to everyone that his physical condition was rapidly worsening. Despite his terrible physical illness and deep exhaustion, he bravely continued guiding the worried community and constantly reminding the people to remain firmly united in their faith. Finally, in the year 632 CE, Prophet Muhammad peacefully passed away in the city of Medina at the age of about 63 years old. For the devoted Muslim community, this was an incredibly emotional and deeply devastating moment. Many loving followers were completely shocked and deeply saddened. Some even found it incredibly difficult to believe that the wise man who had carefully guided them for so many years was truly gone. But in that moment of terrible grief, one of his closest, most trusted companions, Abu Bakr, stepped forward and bravely reminded the weeping people of an incredibly important, eternal truth. He clearly stated that while Muhammad was a great and beloved messenger, the ultimate message of Islam was entirely about God, and God does not die. These powerful, grounding words helped the grieving community regain their spiritual strength and bravely continue moving forward. After his passing, the trusted companions of the Prophet carefully chose Abu Bakr to serve as the very first leader after him. This important leadership position later became formally known as the Caliph, meaning a successor who helps guide and protect the community. Under the careful leadership of Abu Bakr and the wise leaders who followed after him, the Muslim community remarkably continued to grow and thrive. Within the following busy decades, the peaceful message of Islam spread far beyond Arabia, reaching deep into parts of the Middle East, North Africa, Persia, and Central Asia. Over the centuries, magnificent cities like Baghdad, Cairo, and Cordoba later became incredibly important global centers of advanced knowledge, science, and beautiful art. Today, stepping back to look at the modern world, Islam is officially one of the largest and most influential religions on the entire planet. It is faithfully followed by more than 1 billion people across many different vibrant countries and rich cultures all over the globe. What started with one quiet man reflecting alone in the dark cave of Hira slowly grew into a vast community, then into a magnificent civilization, and eventually into one of the most powerful spiritual forces in human history.